Hey, Father, how are you?
I'm well, thanks to God. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody, back to Classical Christian Thought. I'm your host, Eric. I'm here today with Father Patrick, also known as John Ramsey. He's an Eastern Orthodox priest. I don't think he needs any introduction. He's been on the show plenty times, and he's done a lot of debates online. Those of you who are not familiar with him, which I'd imagine is going to be a very few people, only just a couple maybe. Can you introduce yourself briefly for them?
Yes, certainly. Father Patrick, as he said, I'm a priest in the Patriarch of Antioch in England. I have a small parish out in the east of England in the countryside. I am a tutor at the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies, and I'm a web designer as well on part time for those extra side things. And yes, and I've got a master's in theology and a PhD in ecclesiology, which was on the place of St. Peter in the church. So it's an topic of great interest to me, and hence one of the reasons for the discussion tonight.
Thank you so much. Yeah, yeah. So some of our listeners will not know that you have a PhD in ecclesiology centered on the very topic that we're going to be discussing today, which is, as the title suggests, the See of Peter in patristic history, or the Roman Church, or the See of Peter, the position of Peter, to be more exact, um, in the first millennium of the shared heritage between the Latins and the Greeks. And he's actually written a book on this. Isn't that a dissertation turned into a book?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah. And that's available on Amazon, or you don't have any
yes, that's
private
right.
sites for that? Okay. I'll
Yeah.
try to get the link for that in the show notes so that people who are interested can purchase that, because it's just not possible to get everything you wrote in there condensed into one show. So why don't you tell us what do you think? Because we have to have a starting point. We have to have a starting point for what who Peter is, what his position was, and what is the ecclesiological blueprint, you could say, for how that works itself out in history. Obviously, I'm a Roman Catholic, so the listeners are going to know kind of the idea that I would take, but not many people are aware that the Eastern Orthodox have have the capacity to absorb a great deal of the patrinological themes that come up in the first millennium. And it's often the case that people think, oh, the primacy of Peter, that's the Roman Catholics. The equality of Peter, well, that's the Eastern Orthodox. But I think we're going to get a little bit of an education on this, because too many Catholics online, when they think of Peter, the chair of Peter, they think exclusively of the Roman Church in every century in the first millennium. And sometimes when Catholics read about the See of Peter in Antioch, or the See of Peter in Alexandria, or the See of Peter as the episcopate, they kind of, their eyes begin to cross, because it's like, well, that's kind of a malfunction. It's supposed to be gravitating just to Rome, right? So tell us where we can start. Where can we start, a starting point, and then work its way out to develop this theme of Peter and his primacy in ecclesiology?
Right. Well, let's say we can start with points of agreement, such as the commission of Christ to Peter when he gives him the keys. And he does single out Peter there, so that and gives him the keys. And from that, we do see Peter in the book of Acts taking a leading role, and even in the Gospels, he takes a leading role among the disciples. And again, at the end, when he's after denying Christ, he's reconciled about feeding my sheep 3 times. Again, it's a type of thing that he's singled out for this. So I think there's a common agreement that Peter is, in a sense, the head of the apostles, and that he is singled out for that role. So I think that's where we've got a common ground, a starting point. And then we've also, I'm just trying to think which is the best place to go from there. And also what's agreed is that there are the Petrine Sea and the Sea of Peter. And that definitely includes Rome, which was historically known as the Sea of Peter and has the Petrine identity. So I think those are the points of agreement. And also with that Petrine status, this is where some Orthodox would be sort of pushing against a little bit what I'm saying now, but has a position of authority, a position of leadership amongst the other bishops. He's not equal in all ways. And of course, we can talk about equality in the different aspects, but certainly there is a priority and privileges that are ascribed to the Bishop of Rome, and they're not merely honor. There is actual functional aspects through him. I think also the word Peter and Cephas, connected to rock, is also an important aspect of when we speak about Peter. So that includes two things, I think. One is stability, that there's a rock with stability of Peter, and therefore the episcopate through time. And the other one is the connection of the rock to Christ, who is the rock. And so there is a definite connection between Peter and Christ, and through the confession of faith, and the presence of Christ manifest through Peter. And so there's also that deep link in there with a shared common name. So I think in those points, we are in agreement. Yes, from there. Now, from a patristic material, another scripture material, we do have that the keys were to bind and loose for sins. Sins are loosed, they're set free, and whatever is bound on earth is bound here. Now, that same power, though not said in the word of keys, is given to the other apostles later as a whole. So the power to bind and loose is not exclusive for Peter. He certainly just has it first alone, but it's not an exclusive power in itself. And then the other aspect is we've got people like St. Cyprian of Carthage who speak of Peter in the terms of each bishop. So we definitely get some patristic material where there's a linking of Peter and each bishop. So I think, again, we can agree on that material, that it's there. And then there's also the deep heritage of Alexandria, the See of Alexandria, and Antioch also have identified themselves as Petrine sees. And so there's, I think, that clear heritage as well. So that doesn't mean what relation they have or what that means, but I think we can agree that we've got these are just the facts sitting underneath the discussion. So I'll just leave it at that for a moment, then we can ask more questions or develop it out. Or
yeah.
You think I've made a mistake there?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, so there can be a starting point where we both recognize that when Christ established the apostolic government of the church, that he gave us a very unique place to St. Peter, and that role involves authoritative prerogatives. We can agree on that. And it's replete through the Byzantine hymnography and liturgy that Peter is the rock, his confession's the rock, Christ is the rock, and all of these things. But where we start to see our differences between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, as I understand it, is Catholics tend to think that Peter's ministry ends up in Rome at some point. After being in Antioch, for about 7 years. And when he dies in Rome, that sort of leaves this permanent station for an exclusive primacy that he had, such that similar to like a dynastic succession of kings, or a lineal succession of presidents, emperors, whatever, that Rome alone sort of closes uh, this permanent station, such that now all the bishops of Rome, from Saint Clement, the first successor of Peter, forward, uh, that has a permanent, it's the permanent head of the church. Now, is that something, because I'm not even sure you could agree with that. Maybe you could. What would you say to that? Like, because I know that there's different layers of Petrine authority. So how does the historical ministry of Peter and Rome, in your understanding, how does that relate?
Right. Oh, okay. So I think what you've touched on is where we see it, where we depart, and I think this is specific. This particular concept you start seeing more from about the 9th century, but I think it's most best crystallized in the 11th century with Pope Gregory VII. And it sort of builds up in the next couple of hundred years to sort of take its full form, probably by about Florence, actually. Even Lyon's Florence, the full expression of that has come into place. Trent is just simply a recapitulation of that onto vis-a-vis the Protestants, and in the Vatican I is a logical conclusion to that particular line of thought, which we can talk about later. I was very interested in seeing some of your discussion with professor the other night
Yeah.
on some of the issues that has. So we can discuss that later. But let's go, taking a step backwards. So from an Orthodox perspective, say looking at St. Cyprian of Carthage, we can actually take a step back, and even St. Ignatius of Antioch. And what St. Ignatius of Antioch talks about is the Catholic Church is found on each place, so each city, where you have the presence of the bishop and the presbyters. Now, actually, I think historically, we're better not to think of the bishop being in each place, but a synod of bishop and presbyters in each place. And so they're all at some level fairly equal. They all can be called in the early scriptures, they can all be called presbyters, all bishops. Just because they share the name, or you give them the title the presbyters in each place, doesn't mean that there's not a distinction of one from the others. What it shows is there's a certain equality. So if we take a step back to the apostles, Peter is pulled out from the apostles, as singled out. However, the other apostles have the same authority as Peter. They all receive the ability to bind and loose, and essentially the keys, though Peter's singled out. So what we see in each diocese is that one presbyter is singled out, the bishop, and that becomes known as the bishop, from the others. But as far as priest is concerned, he has the same grace, which means of teaching, of the priesthood, and of governance. They all govern the church together, though he centralizes that governance. And so all the apostles governed. It wasn't like Peter sat on a throne and bossed the other ones around. They all ruled with him, but in a way that's coordinated about him. So this is important. So in this case, what happens is that in each diocese, Ignatius talks about the bishop as a place of Christ. So it's Christ who is the center of the church, who unites the apostles. And from him is the origin for ordination of the churches, etc. It is he that is the point. So in a way, the bishop manifests Christ. Now, this is precisely the rock. And so in this case, the bishop is singled out from and St. Ignatius talks about the presbyters as the apostles. So what we've got is the Peter and the apostles in each place. So the worldwide ministry of the apostles is found in each diocese. And so the church is founded on the Christ and the apostles, as it tells us in Ephesians. So each place, the foundation is Christ and the apostles, which is manifest through the bishop and presbyters. And the singling out of one is the singling out of Peter. So each bishop in this way, amongst the other apostles, in a sense, is equals as far as the ministry go. And it's interesting in the West, when they did the orders of ranks of the clergy, the bishop wasn't a separate order. He was actually part of the presbyterian order in the early days. And then it's sort of later where you sort of pull them out a bit more. But matter of fact, there's an important part to recognize he's a priest among priests. And interestingly, in the Roman and Eastern liturgy, the bishop actually takes off all his episcopal insignia that is on the forial when he serves the liturgy. He stands, he was dressed in the chasuble or phalonion, just like the other priests. He stood as priest among priests during the actual offering. He only put on his episcopal regalia when he did an ordination, because he does the ordination as a bishop, and when he communes, because he stands first in order of the others as bishop. But when he actually served the liturgy, he takes off all his identity as a bishop and serves as a priest. Now, this has been corrupted with the use of the imperial garments, etc., in modern times in the East. But I'm just pointing this out to reinforce that the liturgical practice, etc., showed the harmony of the priesthood. And so in each diocese, you get Peter singled out as the rock, as presenting Christ with the apostles in each place. So this is why we can call each bishop Peter, because he stands in that little synod of apostles, of each presbyter being an apostle, and leads them as the first of them. And you can see there's an equality, that they're all priests, they all govern, but he has a central caveat. They only serve with his consent, and he ordains them, so that the priesthood is one. So that's where we can see the Peter in each place. Then I go on to talk about, in the early church, you have a lot of regional synods, metropolitan synods, which is about 10 cities. And these were mapped onto the Roman Empire. I think the church just said it's actually useful just to take the structure, this hierarchical structure we see in the empire, and we'll use that for our structure. So we're not having fights about who's better or worse because I'm a holier or whatever, or my apostle's better than your apostle, etc. Just we'll use the Roman structure for our structure, because we need that. We need a similar structure. And so you get one be a metropolitan who leads the other bishops, and his job is, again, the singularity, that he ordains all the other bishops, and there's nothing decided by the bishops which moves beyond the diocese, or common to all dioceses, without his consent. But there's also a sense of unanimity, that they all speak together, so they all consent. Again, that's showing that equality. But he has a singular part in that, so he's a leadership part and a singularity. So in this way, the metropolitan stands as a bishop, Peter, in relationship to the other apostles, the other bishops, sort of thing. So you've got that. And you see, this was actually very deep in tradition. And I think both in the East and West, this structure has collapsed or been forgotten to a large degree. And that's really sad, because Pope Leo the Great spent a lot of time to protect this. And you see a lot of canons protecting the rights of the metropolitans in this way. So this was the functional part of all ordination of bishops and practical matters of as a courts, really. These were the courts. When a bishop had a fight with his presbyter, they went to the synod court. So they were courts of first instance as such. So these had a very important functional role within the churches, binding the churches in each place. And then these synods had a sort of layer above what's called exarchs, which was sort of Roman multiple regional things linked together. But that was sort of very close to the Petrine sees then, which are the sort of essential sees. You've got the exarchate, and then you've sort of got Rome almost above that as a sort of sense of final court of appeal. But among the exarchates, you've got two that stand out particularly, which is Alexandria and Antioch, which were just exarchate level. Now, Rome was multiple exarchates. It was above that. So you get a see like Thessalonica in the early census, which was an exarchate. He looked after a number of metropolitan sees. He sort of coordinated them and bound them together. And you got more in the west. And Pope Leo spent a lot of time telling these guys off for interfering within the ordinations and stuff in the metropolises. But Alexandria and Antioch were only the same as the exarch. They only had a number of metropolitans after them. It didn't have multiple exarchs. When Constantinople came along, interestingly, it had 3 exarchates given to it under it as a chief see. Just the details of it.
Yeah.
So you get the 3 primary sees, and that's just been Rome and Alexandria and Antioch. And interestingly, in one of the canons of the First Ecumenical Council, you get talks about let the ancient customs prevail, which invoke that Egypt, Libya, and Pentapolis allow the Bishop Alexandria to have authority of all these parts, and also treatment according to a Bishop of Rome. And then likewise, it says in reference to Antioch. Then it stops naming sees in. And this, according to Rome, shows that actually what they're talking about, these are the Petrine sees from ancient customs. So from the beginning of the church, these 3 sees are set up of identity from Peter as the 3 leading sees of the church. And it's another canon which you talk about Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem is not a Petrine see in that sense, but it's see of great honor. So it comes 5th in our ranks, but it's not strictly Petrine. It is honored because of its being the mother of all churches, from which first church was come. There's a holy city of where Christ was. So it's given, but it's done in a separate canon, which just points out that the 3 that are named in this canon are there for some combined reason, and that if you look back, it's the Petrine heritage which you see through the church. Now, also in the canon which talks about Antioch and Alexandria and Rome, it also talks about the metropolitan synods and the importance of those and the stability of those, and that even when Jerusalem becomes honored or recognized, he still has to recognize the metropolitan's job. He can't interfere with that. And that was a tension that was very important, which we'll discuss, we can go on a bit later, is that even though you have these high seas, there was a jurisdiction of a metropolitan which could not be interfered with by these higher seas. It wasn't like they had control right through, that they had a certain level of control above as a seas of appeal, but they couldn't go in and start ordaining bishops inside of these metropolitans. That's a metropolitan's job. It's not the patriarch's job to go and do that. And that's one of the reasons for Canon 28 later on, was to tell off the patriarchs or Constantinople ordaining all the bishops. And the Ecumenical Council said, no, you've no right to do that, despite the equality. So that's sort of set up a structure which you see in the canons in the history of the church, where Peter is sort of at multiple layers. And the only other thing I just want to mention now to throw in is that in the scriptures we see that while Peter is the Prince of Apostles, Paul is also known as Prince of Apostles. As a matter of fact, Peter is called the apostle to the Jews and Paul to the Gentiles. So we've seen an equality of position here. And it is a long, deep tradition of Rome being founded by Peter and Paul. It's not just simply Peter. And also we'll see that Antioch, Paul was in Antioch, so was Peter. And Mark, who was a disciple of Peter, who connects Alexandria as Petrine, was also a disciple of Paul earlier. So we see Peter and Paul together in each of these places. So that's just thrown up in there that, we're in the apostles themselves, the leadership was not simply singular. It was actually 2 that were recognized at the head. So that's just putting a little tension of just the idea of singularity. Hold on a minute, how do you get the second in there as equal apostles? So anyway, that's enough for
yeah. So, I remember us discussing this a while ago, and I broached the question. I don't know if we got into it enough, but it seems as though this structure that we have here with Peter as the bishop, the presbyters as the apostles, and you've got this, a diocesan synod, basically, where it can recreate the dynamic of Peter and the apostles in every church. And so it seems that just on a theory level, that does not require uh, any kind of historical residency of Peter in Rome. So,
Well,
I mean, in other words, in this kind of blueprint, is it possible that Peter went to Bithynia and decided to help the church there and died there instead of Rome, and we would still have the Rome, Alexandria, Antioch. Um,
good question. I think not, that he could have just disappeared. No, I think the fact that he went to these places, that Mark was sent by him to Alexandria, that Paul was also in these places, and Mark seems to be that there was a connection between the presence of Peter. Now, Peter and Paul went to other places. It wasn't like they just sat in two places. So
right.
there was a sense that these sees, Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome, were specially pointed out. So when they talk about the presence of Peter in them, there is more than just simply him having been there. I think there's a sense of a certain appointment of these sees, a certain establishment of an authority in these sees by Peter and with Paul, that establishes him as Petrine, rather than just simply him being there. So there's actually an establishment, an authority that this see is going to have a thing, and I've been here to reinforce that. So I think that's important. Now, interestingly, yes. So while in each diocese you have the Petrine thing, the presbyters, the church, obviously each bishop has to be ordained. So you need a synod above the bishop to ordain the other each bishop. So the church itself can't survive without a synodal structure above the diocese, even though the church is Catholic in each diocese. In other words, because you've got Christ and the apostles in each place, the fullness of the church, or the fullness of the leadership of the church, is in each place. Nevertheless, the bishops have to be ordained by, or at least more properly recognized by the other bishops. And this is a synod, and then one of them consecrates the new bishop. But it's a universal recognition that this is the leader of this, and that this is a Catholic church, which we're looking at. And then, as Leo says, the church converges to one see. And so that it's important that it comes to one, so that the churches are unified, that we're not split out. And you see in Orthodoxy now, we're getting almost a tension where they downplay the Petrine see, and we're getting almost an ethnic churches all doing their own thing, which I think is a bad thing, and people see as a weakness in Orthodoxy, because they've lost the sense of the one central Petrine see. Now, I will also say that it's important that the see is one. It's not 3 or 6 or things, because in a sense, just as the Trinity is one God, we have one see in the sense of the unified. And so that is, again, an important aspect. So we're not 3 different churches all converging against each other, sort of thing. And even the idea of sort of the Orthodox churches and the Roman Church are 2 different. No, something's wrong with that. There's a sense one church. But of course, we have to explain how we understand that, of course, because we have a slightly different concept of what that means. So yes, and the only last point I want to make is there is a correlation between the Roman structure of ranking and the church structure of ranking. And so whether it's intentional or whatever, or all the cause and effect, whatever, certainly we know that Rome was the first city of the empire, Alexandria was the second city of the empire, and Antioch was the third city of the empire. And that is the same ranking which you see in those three C's in the church. So that's also, again, and that's the historical factor. But I think that's important, that Rome as the symbolic capital of the nations. In other words, as far as the empire was concerned, it was the seat where all roads lead to Rome. It was a place where it led the empire, but it was also a place where everyone looked. So the church in Rome would be the most visible to the world. It would be most visible to the leader of the world, the Roman emperor. And therefore, it naturally stands out as the premier witness to the Christian faith. And with that witness comes a responsibility, a stability, etc., etc. So anyway, enough on that. I hope that answers your question sufficiently.
Yeah, that's great. That's good. Yeah. Anybody who's very familiar with the writings of Pope St. Leo the Great will definitely be familiar with what you're saying, because it's quite often that, in Catholic apologetics, for example, people will go to, a bunch of quote mines from Pope St. Leo the Great. But you could also provide another florilegium from Leo on these concepts that we're talking about here, about the privileges of the See of Rome, the See of Alexandria, See of Antioch, from the Petrine root. And so if we're going to absorb the ecclesiology of Leo the Great, we're going to have to figure out how to incorporate this multi-layered patrinity. I don't know, for lack of another word, this multi-layered Petrine hierarchy, and but when you read Leo the Great or any other patristic writer that talks about this, I know you had mentioned Ignatius of Antioch, sort of the primitive foundations of the local church, the local synod. Leo the Great does seem to put some unique emphasis, or maybe not emphasis, but he seems to think that there was a divine configuration with Peter going to Rome, Paul going to Rome, and then also, his having been in the See of Antioch for 7 years, and also that his primary disciple, Mark, who went to Egypt, that this was not just accidental. This was, it was sort of like, I mean, I'm trying to compare this to something easy for the listeners to understand, but just in the way that the location of Jerusalem was of divine configuration in the Old Testament, it seems like Leo would say that Rome, Alexandria, Antioch are not in precisely the same way, but that these three places are sort of beneficiaries of a divine blueprint for the government of the church. And he seems to say that the privileges are irrevocable, right? In some of his letters, especially when the Council of Chalcedon, refloats the third canon of Constantinople I. He seems to want to emphasize this more and more because he sees the Rome, Alexandria, Antioch Trinity, or I hate to call it that, but it's that tripartite hierarchy. He seems to think that Constantinople's elevation is going to go against this divine blueprint. So my next, I have two questions. How would you reconcile Leo the Great's belief that these privileges are perpetual, irrevocable, and Orthodoxy's belief that the See of Rome has, in a sense, fallen in some sense, right? And then secondly, the rise of Constantinople. How does that get ironed out with Rome? Not just Leo, but Gelasius, Hilary, some of the other popes that largely contested the this elevation of Constantinople as being consistent with what we're talking about between Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch.
Right. Yeah. No. I think in an orthodox sense as well. And now, I'm speaking. There's some Orthodox who will probably disagree with me here in the polemics that have occurred. But I think there's a very strong case looking at the Fathers that, and looking at the canon from Nicaea, that definitely the order of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch is divine. It is set up by God. As a matter of fact, the canon of the Ecumenical Council is the testimony of God. So we definitely believe this structure is set up by God, and it is irrevocable. That it cannot be changed. We can't mess around with this ordering. So that is actually what we should believe as Orthodox, that this is divine, it is established, and it's irrevocable. And there is, and being Peter, there is a rock status to this. That means a stability to this. That it's not going to just wash away in time. That these seas are going to remain basically until Christ comes in some way or another. But now, in the issue of losing Rome, just my initial point is that, well, Rome has got the same problem of losing Alexandria and Antioch at the schism. And so they've got to, how did they lose out? Because they are Petrine as well. And so what's going on here? Now, the Orthodox solution to that is rather that it's interesting in Constantinople. Now, I actually think that Leo's arguments and his position on the canons, I totally agree with. I think he's absolutely right on the mark about the irrevocability of the canons of Nicaea, the irrevocability of the ordering of the seas. You see this right through all the canons. Once metropolitan is made, another city gets the same rank, but it's just honor. It's just simply honor. Now, interesting, the canons really carefully pick out just honor and actual privileges. So to people who just say all the Petrine stuff is just simply honor, that's nonsense. That's not what the canons talk about. They talk about real privileges and real priorities, as such as the seals of appeal. Now, as I understand what's happened with Constantinople, it's that Rome as Rome as a see of the church in the city of Rome was given priority. So the bishop of the church in the city of Rome was the first of bishops. Now, what happens is that Constantinople wasn't just simply an imperial capital. There are other cities which the empire lived in, etc. Milan for a while, and Nicaea, and things like this. So, but they never suddenly took on this rank among the churches. No, what's happened is that Constantine, as the emperor, when he created Constantinople, he created it as Rome. He created it as the city of Rome, including the Senate, all the marks of what it is to be the city of Rome, not as a location on a map down this river, but city of Rome as the capital of the empire. Even on the map, there's 7 hills of Constantinople as well. There's the Senate goes there. So what he does is he actually identifies Constantinople as Rome. So as far as Constantine is concerned, it is Rome. That city is Rome. Now, he's not replacing the old Rome. A lot of people don't understand this. So as you said earlier, Peter moved from place to place. The fact he left Antioch doesn't mean his authority leaves Antioch. It continues in the bishops of Antioch there. But it also, he goes to Rome because he wants to make that the first see. So when the Orthodox talk about Constantinople as new Rome, it's not replacing. Rome stays as Rome. But so in effect, you've got Rome in 2 places. But for the empire, there can only be 1 capital. So Constantine, in saying this, is actually identifying there as one capital in two locations. And then the father said, well, hold a minute. The Bishop of Rome inherits the promises of Peter because he is the bishop of the city of Rome. It divides into the city. The bishops who inherit the episcopal throne of Rome inherit the things from Peter. So in other words, in this case, the inheritance is given to the city, to the throne of a city. And whoever sits on the throne takes the authority of that city. It's not passed from bishop to bishop. So one pope doesn't ordain his next pope. He dies, and then the bishops, by a normal process of ordaining a new bishop, ordain him. So they don't have any papal authority in themselves. All they are doing is appointing a new bishop for that throne. As soon as he sits on the throne, he inherits all the authority of Peter. And so what's happened in Constantinople is that, well, now the bishop in what was Byzantium is now the bishop of Rome. He is the bishop of Rome. Well, now Peter gave the authority to the bishops of Rome. Well, he must also have the same authority as the bishops of Rome because he is the bishop of Rome. And so that's why in Constantinople they recognized him as equal to Rome, but they mention it as New Rome, and you get that in the Council of Chalcedon. It's again New Rome. It's because it's Rome, and so they had no option because the bishop of the city of Rome must have these privileges. So that's why I said they have equal privileges. However, to avoid breaking to two churches, the Rome still has a priority over New Rome, and that's why it comes second to it. But this is like, imagine a golf game where both players get the same total at the end. They are first equal after the 4 rounds of golf, but then you have to decide which one is better. So relative to all the other golfers in the tournament, these two are first equal. They both won in a sense, but to distinguish them, you have a playoff, and then one takes priority over the other to be the actual winner in a sense. So in this way, the bishops of Constantinople as Rome actually are equal to that, but to keep the unity and the privilege of the older one, because they don't want to destroy the order. The order remains. Rome must stay first. So it stays first relative to Constantinople. But Constantinople doesn't become second like Alexandria was second. It becomes first equal. So Alexandria actually still stays second to Rome. It's just that there's now two bishops in Rome, one in the west and one in the east, but they're both bishops of Rome. So when we talk about, even after the schism, the east never lost the See of Rome. The See of Rome continues in Constantinople. Now, it doesn't call itself Petrine because Peter didn't actually go there. It's not one of the original places where he went, but it's something afterwards. They say by God's will, because Constantine said this is now Rome, that they say, oh, well, we have to recognize the bishop as the same as that. So he takes the same privileges. And again, Canon 28 talks about privileges, not just honor. It's not a thing, it's real authority. And you see in the history of church afterwards that in the East, Constantinople did everything you see in the first millennium that Rome was doing in the West, and even in broader sense. And so what you get is, in liturgically, so everybody in the West follows Rome, and everyone in the East follows New Rome. They all do the same liturgical style. It becomes like the center of focus of all the other churches. Even at Alexandria and Antioch follow Rome, which, just to build on this, is there's something about being the capital of the first see of Rome, which did have a priority over Alexandria and Antioch, which were regional cities. And we see this liturgically, we see this in the final courts of appeal, etc. There was a difference. So I think, I just want to make a point here that to distinguish between Petrine See and Rome, and the authorities of Rome as a see, and the Petrine authority of the Petrine See. I want to just distinguish that. So if I may just go on.
Go ahead.
Pope Gregory the Great, he talks about one see and 3 bishops and he talks about the inequality of the Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. And he says this in a formal letter to the Pope of Alexandria, who calls himself Pope as well. So
Eulogius
so
of Alexandria.
at this level, they're all the one Petrine see. There's just one see, but it's in three places. Just as we've got one God and three hypostases, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, they're all the same as God, but we distinguish between them, and two are sort of derived, or take us derived from the other one, but we don't say they're less. So in this way, while Rome is the center see, the other two are still fully Petrine, and they're still fully the rock, and so have a stability, etc. So everything that's about in Peter, and they have their own regions of which they have a central see to. But Rome has more of a universal way of that. So as Petrine, they're all equal, but Rome because it's the imperial capital, because it's where they died, Peter and Paul died, etc., has a slightly higher functional role than the other two. But I would argue that each of them is in itself the fullness of a Petrine see. So, and this is where I think we can just have a bit of a discussion later about the discussion you had the other night with what's happening with Pope Francis and what does that mean for Peter and stability and tradition, etc. The Orthodox position would be it doesn't matter if one or the other bishops fall, as long as at least one of them continues, and then the other ones will be put back into place again, they'll recover. It might be one or two of them go off in a row, but then afterwards God will restore an Orthodox bishop there. And so there's much more flexibility in one or two bishops becoming heretical or falling into heresy without the See of Peter collapsing into breaking that solidity of tradition. Now, clearly, in the first millennium, Rome, by and large, except for one bishop, until about the 10th century, then it's very interesting. It remains solid in orthodoxy. It really, God's providence keeps it very solid in its orthodox witness, but not in an absolutist sense. There was a couple of exceptions in there. But nevertheless, since the schism, you'll see that where do you call Roman or New Rome, Constantinople has actually itself remained very solid. It hasn't gone off into wild heresies, except for the division between Rome and Constantinople. It's been actually very stable. We haven't had many heretics, if any, since then, and maybe a couple. And so is Alexandria and Antioch. They've been stable. They're still here. They're still the fathers of Orthodox, they're still teaching the Orthodox faith. So in that sense, we say, well, the stability is still here in the Orthodox sense as well. But it doesn't require an infallibility sense, because we're not relying on one see to be constantly perfect. We can have one of them mess up for a while and then be restored back again. As long as it's not a permanent mess up, it's just one or two bishops in a row, then there's an Orthodox bishop back. And that allows God's providence to work more without destroying or forcing the freedom of each bishop. It allows them some space. So that's our sort of reason why we think that the three C's in one is important to stop the sense of one having to be infallible, which is absolutely the case what Rome fell into, because it becomes exclusively Rome, and in which case I completely understand the doctrine of infallibility once you get to that stage. Of course, the manifestation of that becomes interesting. But anyway, I think that's enough for that.
Yeah. So just so the listeners are aware, some of them are familiar with the third canon of Constantinople 381 and the 28th canon of Chalcedon and the 36th canon of the Quinisex Council 692, which says that because Constantinople is New Rome, it is accorded equal privileges as Old Rome, because Old Rome was given those privileges as the capital city. Now, would you agree that arrangement of making Old Rome, the city in Italy, the the chief church, the prima sedes, the first see, that was done during the life of Saint Peter the Apostle and the life of Saint Paul the Apostle?
Yeah. No, I think the Canon 6 of Nicaea, when it says that the ancient customs prevail, well, this is 300 AD when they're talking about this. What do you mean ancient customs? Where do these ancient customs come from? Do we have any writings of some sort of synod in the about 200 AD or 150 AD providing these customs? No, we have no such thing. And all we've got actually goes back to a deep tradition of Peter setting this out, setting Mark off and this. So this is apostolic, and if it's apostolic, it is also of God. And again, as Orthodox say, when it comes to the canons, they are the testimonies of God. So we understand Constantinople's rise is divine will. It is just as much as divine will as the initial thing of Rome. That God's will is God's will, and this is equally God's will and equally indefectible, etc. So I think Leo, sorry, just to touch on this, Leo was very right in what he was arguing. I think he didn't quite grasp this nuance of New Rome as actually being Rome. And he's sort of thinking about a Constantinople. Well, how can this city come up? And okay, it's imperial city. And he's thinking very quickly of the Peter, Peter came here, etc. So he didn't quite get, and then not most people don't seem to get it, this idea that this is Rome. And the fathers went, well, this is Rome. In that case, the bishop must be inherit what Peter gave to Averroes. So he missed this point. But otherwise, I completely agree with all his arguments. So they're perfectly right. It's just this nuance of understanding New Rome, Constantinople as New Rome, which is what the canons point out. And they're very careful to do that. And that is what justifies the position of Constantinople and its equality, etc., because it is Rome.
So contrary to what a lot of Catholics and Orthodox think, the third canon of Constantinople 381, the 28th canon of Chalcedon, which talks about the rise of Constantinople as New Rome because Old Rome was given its privileges because of its being the capital city, that a lot of Catholics and Orthodox think that that's like some sort of a post-apostolic, man-made ecclesiastical custom that none of the apostles knew about. And what we are saying here is that this arrangement happened under the leadership of the apostles Peter and Paul.
Yeah. So where I actually think we're both in agreement. Peter and Paul went to Rome because it was the capital city, but it's them that it's not. I think people struggle with this a little bit when I've had discussions. The apostles used the structure of the empire at the time to establish the structure for the church. So a lot of people say, this developed later. No, all the structure of the metropolitan sees and the Petrine sees was right there from the beginning. It's actually really important for the church, the unity of the churches, to have the structure in place. And it was divine providence, it is divine order. But they went to the capital because it was the first city of the empire. It was and it mapped. So if you're going to have the first see of a church, it's appropriate to put it in the first see of the empire. So that the image of a city, because the churches were put in cities, and so the rank of a city was a natural reflection of the rank of the church, and it saved any arguments, as I said before, about who's holier, pious, etc. It just simply maps onto it. However, once it's mapped by the apostles, the church structure does not change due to the changes of the imperial structure. So later, when Old Rome became a sort of, like I said, provincial city, it ceased to function as the capital. The bishop still continues as the first bishop, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century of the churches. So his rank, although it was established, mapped onto the city structure, and because it was imperial city, that see got the first place. Nevertheless, it doesn't change with the change of a political tide. But what happens in Constantinople is not a change of political tide. It's not because suddenly this city became higher, now I'm going lower. It's because of its identity of Rome. It said, this is now Rome. And the fathers went, well, in that case, it must, because of the emperor who could make this decision, said this is Rome, this is the capital. So he identified the city of Rome. So the reason Peter Paul went to Rome was not because it was happened to be on this river, it happened to be in this geological thing that, oh, Italy has to be the place. It has to be this spot in Italy where the first sea takes place, because nowhere else in the world you can have it. No, it's not based on that. It's based on the political reality of what Rome was. That's why they went there. By God's instruction, by God's will, by God's plan, and the apostles went there and established it themselves. This is not sort of just an accident. This is God's will. But so when Rome and Constantinople becomes Rome, and all the things that mattered to why the Peter and Paul went to Rome in the first place and gave the privileges to the bishops of that city because of its political rank, not to be changed by political rank, then that's why fathers talk about, because it's equal as in its political rank, the identity of the cities, is that's what identifies as Rome. That's the important thing, not the geographical thing, but it's imperial capital. And it's not about just being an imperial capital. It's identity to Rome. It is Rome. And that's what drives the fathers to have to give the things. And this is God's will. They take it, this is God's will. And seeing it's now Rome, they have to give the privilege. They had no option. Yeah. Because the apostles had given the bishop of Rome that because he was the bishop of Rome. And now this bishop is also the bishop of Rome. He must receive the same ones. So for their logic, they had no choice. This was actually fulfilling the divine will expressed through Peter and Paul in Rome.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to summarize here, to make it clear for everyone who's listening, because I think both the Orthodox and the Catholic audience may be getting an education here, because you'll understand what I mean when some Orthodox, they'll weaponize the third canon of Constantinople 381 and the 28th canon of Chalcedon as a proof that the ancient primacies had nothing to do with apostolic design. And so when you start to see that, and it's been around for a while, what you're saying is very different than that. It's obviously not trying. It's not painting a Roman Catholic understanding of the history, but it's also not painting sort of the caricature that you see sometimes from the Orthodox side, which weaponizes those canons in order to de-apostolize the primacy of Rome. And so what you're saying in summary is that Rome, Alexandria, Antioch were all locations and cities where Peter specifically held residency, or he had sort of a vicarious primacy through Mark. These cities became the chief cities of the empire, and because of that, Peter decided that this was going to be the chief, sort of the hierarchical geolocation of the church's main, the hierarchy. But that at Rome, Peter and Paul invest their special primacy for that city church, making it the first see. That sort of indissoluble deposit in the city of Rome gets reflected in Constantine's establishment of New Rome in what we call today modern Turkey. So when Constantine moved the capital to New Rome,
we mustn't think he moved the capital. He didn't transfer it away from Rome. He establishes Rome in a second place. So the old Rome stays the capital. It does not move away. And I think this is an important thing. Constantinople is a second manifestation of the same city. It's not transferred. Old Rome takes its priority still, but it's Rome manifested in a second place.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a mirror, like a reflection. So you have the substance, and then you have a mirror that sort of reflects the substance. So it's kind of like two cities that are Rome.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay,
So as a capital city, they're one, but
right.
in the geographical locations, they're two.
There two, right? Location two, city one. Now, when Constantine did that, it's a matter of ontological, um it's of a natural consequence that the location of where New Rome is going to inherit the very same thing that exists in Old Rome, and the inheritance at Old Rome came from Peter and Paul. And so in this way, what you're saying is you're connecting the primacy of Peter and Paul to the primacy of the location of New Rome.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want the listeners to know what it is that you're saying, because I see some people in the comments there that they're, some of them are not understanding. I want them to understand that you're trying to base all of this in the apostolic, in apostolic origin. You see what I'm saying?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes, 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 yes. It's not some sort of political thing afterwards from emperors, or it's not something that the fathers just sort of made up later on. No, this is part of the tradition of the church, such as established by the apostles
right.
through Christ. Yeah.
Right. So I think we've made a lot of headway here, because we're clearing up a lot of misunderstanding. And to be sure, I agree with a lot of what you said, because um, I'm thinking of just a lot of the early imperial edicts and a lot of the early patristic statements about Rome city. Like, for example, when people one of the first authors that describes the primacy of Rome from an Eastern point of view was Theodoret of Cyrus, and he's writing to Pope Leo. He says, what makes your church the greatest, right? And he names a few things. Peter was there, Paul was there. He mentions that there's never been a heretic in the chair of Rome. But he also says the rank of the city, right? And so, just so some of the listeners might be thinking that, well, Father Patrick's theory is dominated by secular politics, but this is coming from Leo the Great, Theodoret of Cyrus. We can't ignore what they were saying about the rank of cities in the Roman Europe, the Roman world, uh, in our understanding. So I think we've made major headway here. Unfortunately, I'm limited on time. I've only got a few minutes left, but I think that this is such a successful point that we've made here about trying to understand Nicaea, Canon 6 of Nicaea 1, and then understanding the rise of Constantinople, um, the the multiplicity of Petrine primacies in different cities, as well as going down to the essential level of the church and the diocese with Peter and the presbyters, with the necessity, like you said, of something above the diocese to regulate the unity of the bishops. I think that this is an extremely well found, it's a successful um, demonstration that we've put here. Would you be interested in doing a second part, so where we can now go further into what's going to diverge Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox on this point? Because this is a hefty subject. I think it's going to have to be broken up into pieces. So, what do you think of that, Father
Yeah,
Patrick?
no, I'm happy to do that, and no, it's why I think I wanted to have this discussion. So we do it rather than this as the debate to develop the discussion, and I think that helps make clearer later on where things are moving through. And I think we are, yeah, there's a lot more kind of togetherness and at least recognizing the what is consistent with patristic
Yeah.
heritage there.
Yeah.
Um, and just keep building on. Yeah, I think that'd be
Okay.
really interesting to keep going.
Okay, good, good. All right, so classical Christian thought audience, I ask you to let this get absorbed and let it simmer in your mind. Some of the things you may have heard, if you're a Catholic, you're like, well, wait a minute, I thought that Peter in Rome, and that's it. The whole thing is, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. That's it. That's it. Um, well, listen and re-listen to what we've said here. Go to the link for Father Patrick's book if you want to dive in and just completely see the patristic citations that he'll give you and some of the things that you won't be able to ignore. Okay, because it's written by the church fathers. Let it simmer. Try and take some notes in what we're saying here. I tried to summarize every time Father Patrick ended. I tried to summarize and summarize. So just re-listen to it, formulate some questions from this. We will come back. Maybe we could do this in a couple of weeks. We could probably do a second part, and we will pick it up from where we are now. Okay. So Father Patrick, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Really enjoyed all of your articulations. Classical Christian thought. Please like this video, share it. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And you guys all have a pleasant rest of your day.